Hello everyone, George Attio expert from Craft here. Today I'm showing you how to connect Xero to your Attio account. This is the real life case study we did for one of our customers. Let's go. The gist is you use a Xero account where you manage all your invoice accounting. You also have line items and products. What do you need to make this work like the client did? Attio, Xero, and create a Xero developer account and n8n account. My goal is to show you the basics. So let's get started. First, let's start with n8n. The essence of the automation is this. Every time an invoice is created or updated, we want to create or update that invoice in Attio. The Xero API has webhooks for this. And in addition, in your Xero developer account, you can create a custom app that will allow you to receive these webhooks and send them to n8n. I will leave a link in the comments for how to connect Xero to n8n. The first step is simple. Receive a webhook and insert the data provided by your Xero account. The second step, since Xero requires us to return a signature upon successful receipt of the webhook, requires a bit of code. If you don't have coding experience, just ask n8n AI and it will handle this task perfectly. Next, we need to create a logical branch. If signature is valid, respond to webhook with 200 code. If you update or create invoices very quickly, the webhook may not trigger for every invoice, as Xero may delay sending invoices to n8n. To process each request, you need to do the following. We need to separate each incoming event to retrieve invoice information, so we can process each invoice separately. Now we need to get information about the invoice that was triggered during automation. To do this, we need to use a node getInInvoice to connect to Xero and OAuth 2.0 connection is required. We use the invoice ID from the resource ID we received in the webhook. After this step, we will receive all the information related to the invoice: status, contact, organization, line items, products, and etc. What's the problem with integrating n8n with Attio? Line items come as an object in Attio, and Attio does not allow looping. A process for iterating over line items one by one or splitting them separately. Since there can be a lot of line items, we split them in n8n itself. If we only split line items, then because we are splitting invoices, all line items will end up attaching to the single invoice we processed first. To ensure line items are correctly linked to each invoice, we also need to split invoice ID, invoice number, and the date, if you need them. After this step, your automation will trigger as many times as there are line items in the invoice. You can set up a filter node in n8n, so only necessary invoices with associated line items will be sent. Next, we set up edit fields. Firstly, to make it easier to specify the path in Attio for parse.json. Secondly, in n8n you can immediately perform operations that will retrieve the domain from an email, convert the date to the required format, or combine several fields and create a variable. Since n8n charges for executing the automation, not for each step, this is the most cost-effective approach. Next, we set up send HTTP block and insert the URL we receive in Attio when creating the automation with the receive a webhook trigger. By the way, if you would like to create the same automation or something similar, we offer free automation for you. All the details are in the description. First step in the Attio automation is receiving a webhook. This URL is then added to the send HTTP request node in the n8n workflow. Next, to correctly interpret the incoming request, we need to parse the received JSON payload. For this, we use the parse.json block and map the variables that are being sent from n8n. If you need track invoice dates and due dates, there is an important limitation to be aware of. Unfortunately, Attio cannot natively accept or process date type fields. To work around this, in n8n we use a formula that calculates the number of days from the trigger moment to the invoice date and due date. These values are sent as numbers. We then use two adjusted time blocks and rely on these values later in the automation. Next, we use a switch block to determine whether the invoice action is create or update, since each case follows a different workflows. If the invoice is an update, we search for the invoice by invoice ID. If the invoice not found, the workflow stops and no action is taken. If the invoice exists, we use another switch block to track the invoice status and update it accordingly. We search for line items by name. If found, we update the invoice with the new status, total amount, and dates. Then we update the line items, quantity, unit price, and total line item price. If the invoice is a create, the logic is similar, but we immediately start with a switch block that checks the invoice status. In this flow, we create or update person based on email address, create or update the company based on domain, create or update sales using the invoice ID, sales means invoice, create or update product using the SKU, and find line items by a combined name. Combined name means invoice number plus product SKU. Then we use a switch block to check whether the line items already exist. If it exists, we update the line item and the related invoice. If it doesn't exist, we create the line item and then update the invoice. This is the automation we ended up with. Let me know in the comments whether this video was useful for you, and how are you currently managing invoices from Xero to your Attio account.